So I'm, of course, here from the United States, where government is not in good shape in many respects. Of course, we have a highly well-functioning government that is the envy of many, if not most, countries. But it's not how most people feel about government, at least not at the federal level. People don't trust government to do things well. They don't trust the executive branch, and they don't trust Congress. They don't trust our legislature very much at all. But this is not a domestic phenomenon exclusively. It is a global phenomenon that people are losing trust in public sector institutions, but also in institutions more generally, whether it's church or state or whether it's media or other organizations. As we all know, there is a crisis of confidence in our organizations and institutions. Now, there are some places that fare worse on these metrics, right? You can see some of the numbers up here of the places where people trust government the least. And obviously, though, coming with this message to Singapore, a place where, in fact, trust in government is not suffering the same kind of declining numbers that we're seeing. And I think what's important is not just that the numbers are low, but that they're declining, and that the lack of trust and faith and confidence extends both to governing institutions and also to democratic institutions. Here, though, we're in a place where government, like, again, many places in the United States, and surely at the state and local level where people trust government more, things are in relatively good shape and well-functioning. But I would put to you that regardless, we are going to face, if we aren't there already, a crisis of confidence in our institutions because there are tremendous challenges that we have to tackle. There are hard problems like climate change. There are issues that are politically fraught like immigration that are roiling so many countries and placing great essentially pressure on political parties and on political movements. There's the fear that so many people have that the robots will eat all our jobs tomorrow, and that even if our jobs aren't gotten rid of, that they will be transformed by the likes of machine learning and AI that will transform every profession. That these technologies that comprise the technologies of automation are going to change the way that we work. And the big challenge is that we don't know how. It's the uncertainty about what will happen. Do you open the paper every day, your paper, your former paper, and there isn't a day that doesn't go by where there isn't a piece about the future of work that doesn't publicize some study that tells us either that the robots will eat all our jobs, 47% says Oxford University, or that it will create an abundance of new jobs and we will all become caregivers and baristas and live happily ever after. The problem is we don't know where things are going. But we do know that whichever way they're going in two directions, right? There's an increasing divide, increasing inequality that we're facing in terms of widening income gaps, widening equality gaps, a pressure on wages both downward and upward. And that's leading to disparities in outcomes that I would argue, and I think most people would agree, are untenable. At present, I wear with one hat the role of Chief Innovation Officer of the state of New Jersey. It's the home state that I was born in, next to New York. And it is a place in which if you are African American, you are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than if you are white. The fact that anybody is likely to die in childbirth is problematical, but the fact that we have disparities of outcomes around maternal child health, around educational outcomes, around income outcomes, not to mention the fact that obviously wages for ordinary people are not increasing, and we see an ever-widening divide between the haves and the have-nots. So all that to say, even in places where the state is highly technocratic and well-functioning and effective for the most part and taking out the trash, which in many places is something the government doesn't manage to accomplish, that our institutions are not functioning as well as they need to, as well as they ought to address the challenges that either we're facing today or will be facing tomorrow. And those challenges are here. It's not the fact that the future of work is in some far distant future. That future is now. It's just creating crises of inequality that we need to deal with. Now, when it comes to talking about the private sector and how we respond to these challenges, the discussion in any one of these countless reports is one about the need to invest in lifelong learning. right? So we say we're worried about wages being depressed, we're worried about transformations of jobs, we're worried about preparing workers for tomorrow. What's the solution? There are a variety of interesting policy solutions, but they all come down more or less, and Singapore has been a leader in this area of investing in lifelong learning for workers. We say there needs to be a new skill set, we need to upskill, we need to retrain, not just by coming to fancy colleges and graduate schools, but we need to have availability of, access to affordable forms of training and learning throughout the career cycle. What we talk a little less about, I would say, is what that means for public sector workers and those working not in the private economy, but for government, or with government, or in the public interest. And I would put to you that there is similarly a need to upskill and reskill and invest in training in new ways for people from the public sector or working in the public interest, to create what I would call, and we can leave this for the discussion at greater length, what I would call the public entrepreneur. So there is a strong component of what it means to be a public entrepreneur, which is a story about tech and data and digital, which is very much at the forefront of people's thinking here. But I want to suggest to you that the public entrepreneur, the skill set of the public servant in the 21st century, and the role of the public servant in the 21st century, is to be somebody who is not the expert solving problems on their own, but it is the person who is the effective 21st century public servant is the person who knows how to solve problems with others, with data and with people to develop more effective solutions. 3 quick illustrations. Samir Brahmachari, former head of Science India, confronted with the problem that tuberculosis is a drug that affects the poor, and as a result, drug companies are not advancing cures for tuberculosis and other tropical diseases that affect the poor quickly enough. He found something called the Open Source Drug Discovery Project and gets 8,000 volunteers, puts the collective intelligence, the hearts and the heads and the minds and the hands of 8,000 people across India and across the world working together on annotating the TB literature. And with a $12 million grant, which is a drop in the bucket when it comes to drug discovery, is able to go from discovery to clinical trial on a new TB drug for the first time in 40 years. Dinora Cantu, actually a former student of mine, currently the Chief Innovation Officer and Chief Participation Officer of the city of San Pedro Garza de Garcia in Mexico. Dinora went back to her home community and was confronted with the challenge that children are driving, their parents are driving them to school every day. It would be a real problem if the children were driving to school. The parents are driving the children to school by car every day. That means significant pollution, significant traffic, and incredible time and productivity and educational opportunity wasted by having children sit in cars. But the government is under-resourced. It's a wealthy community, but it's still a small public sector. So they create an open innovation competition called Desafios, a challenge competition to engage citizens, and then to train those citizens mentored by experts from around the world to develop solutions to a range of challenges, including the problem of single-family vehicles. Within 1 year, they've developed 10 projects and implemented 5, including the project around changing transportation options to school and reducing the number of people driving to school from 85% to 25% using single-family vehicles within 1 year. Jonathan Wachtel is somebody I had the pleasure to meet last week. He is an urban planner from a community outside Denver called Lakewood, Colorado. Again, fairly wealthy suburb, but still a government that doesn't have all the resources, and a community of people who have among them people who know science, who know engineering, who have the brains and the smarts, and the passion to develop strategies for helping the town to become more sustainable and respond to climate change. So he's launched an initiative to actually support and enable neighborhoods to develop their own sustainability plans, to come up with and define the problems that they're solving, come up with the solutions, and then the city provides support to them. The model is so successful that now 4 other communities have copied it, and they've created a network where citizens are sharing peer-to-peer the solutions that are working in their own communities. Colorado, if you may know, from the west of the United States, is a fairly libertarian place. People don't like to be told what to do. And so the mayor's charge to him was, I will let you go do this with citizens so long as you don't tell people what to do, otherwise they won't re-elect me. And that political charge allowed him to give the breathing room to citizens to come up with their own solutions and to implement them with some support from the city. Not even financial support, just helping them to clear the hurdles that they need to implement their plans. What do these 3 examples illustrate? They illustrate, to me, a toolkit, a skill set that public entrepreneurs need to have in the 21st century, and that is the ability to solve problems using data and using collective intelligence at every stage in the problem-solving process. Now, in an effort, again, to have a conversation, I'm not going to go into all of these in detail. I'm just going to breeze through a couple of them, but to sum them up, essentially they fall into a set of stages at which the goal is, again, to define problems, to come up with solutions, to implement them, and then to measure what works, always thinking about how we can be open, how we can have a conversation with people so that we can do so. Let me say at the outset, so I don't I'm not trying to save any surprises for the end, and I don't want to forget to say that the reason to do this is not because it's a nice to have. It's not because working with citizens is the right thing to do, which it is. It's not because it's more legitimate, which it is. It's because the collective intelligence and capacity of members of the public, businesses, universities, companies, and institutions allow government to extend its own capacity and be more effective at solving problems. It's a must-have. And essentially, this is, again, 3 slides that say the same things in different ways, depending on how you learn, if you like the visual or you like the words. But let me dive in on just 1 or 2 of these skills and talk about what I mean. The first is the need to define problems. Now, we're in a public policy school, and you've probably taken a course on policy analysis, or maybe if you're a professional, you've done something on project management where you have surely talked about defining problems. That's not a new idea. And we all know that defining problems is this extremely important part of the project management process. But the challenge is, I believe, that we're not teaching students and we're not learning how to define problems with others. We're doing so, with our policy analysis textbooks and, doing the deep dive in the library, but the opportunity to actually talk to and work with people to define the problem as they experience it is a profound and important opportunity that we're missing. And when we do that, it sometimes allows us to redefine and reframe the problem that we're solving. So has anybody here had to read, have you ever read Russell Acuff's The Art of Problem Solving?
Nope.
Have you ever heard of the slow elevator problem?
No.
No?
Oh, and this is with mirrors?
Oh, you spoiled the punchline. Yeah, that's going to speed up. That saves me some time here since I only want to talk for 5 more minutes. So the slow elevator problem, it is a well-known business school case, and it's taught at Harvard Business School and other places, is that the hotel manager, has guests complaining because the elevator's too slow, so he hires the engineer who says you have to replace the elevator at great cost and expense. Not being satisfied with this answer because it costs too much money, he goes out and sources ideas from a wide range of other people, and the psychologist comes and says to him, I have a better idea. The problem is not that the elevator is too slow, the problem is that the wait is too long. The solution, put up a mirror for $5. It's the point being that when we extend our capacity by defining problems with others, it allows us to redefine the problem into something that may be more tractable and more actionable. We have to do so not just by talking, but we have to not only define the problem with others, we have to do so also by using data in order to understand problems more effectively. right? So we can go out and talk to, for example, people about the problem of gun violence. But we have to also look at the trends on the data. We have to see where the gun violence is happening. We have to do as they did in San Francisco, where they were trying to solve the problem of bike accidents, to see where are the hot spots, where are the accidents actually happening. We had to, in Mexico, the government wanted to understand how to improve the educational system, so they needed to look at the data about payment of teachers and about performance of schools, and it was only by looking at the data that they were able to see that, in fact, 1,500 people on the payroll all have the same birthday, are all 102 years old, and are all getting paid more than the president of Mexico. So, right, we know that we need to use the data. But we also know that what we have to do is to talk to people about the problems. And that's why so many people are turning to the use of human-centered design, to actually talking to citizens about the problems as they experience them, not only then to define the problem, but then, and let me, whoops, I'm going to skip ahead to, sorry, more people talking to citizens slides, to also then not only define problems with citizens, but to actually develop solutions with citizens. So at the first stage, we need up front to be able to talk to people about what the problem is, but then we also need to engage people in what we might call open innovation, or crowdsourcing, or citizen engagement, and has lots of names. We also need to begin to engage people in coming up with solutions to problems. And by people, I mean ordinary residents and citizens. I mean, as in this case, other people working in government. I mean, as the US federal government has done, turning to experts, those people with special know-how among citizens to solve hard problems like how to build the next generation space vehicle. Over 1,000 open innovation challenges have been run on challenge.gov. It's about engaging with communities, as Dana Lewis has done in the DIY Pancreas Project. She is a diabetic who was looking for a better way to track her insulin, administer the insulin, and do all the things that diabetics need to do. So she not only hacked her own pancreas, but she has a community of hundreds of diabetic sufferers who are working with her to perfect and improve a medical device that the market hasn't yet delivered, and to improve the lives and the suffering of diabetics. So let me wrap up by saying that this was a whirlwind, just glimpse and introduction to the notion that there is, I believe, a skill set that people need as public servants and public entrepreneurs in the 21st century. We were curious about whether this skill set is widely distributed or not. So we asked this summer 400 public servants in Australia about 9 innovation skills that you saw on this pathway. We asked 400 and some public servants in the United States about 6 of those skills. We have a shorter attention span in the United States, though a little bit of a shorter survey. And what we found is, despite the importance of these skills, that the majority of people do not actually use them yet. They can explain them to you, they can tell you what they are, but they don't actually use them. And perhaps importantly, when they do use them, though, they use them a lot. So once people learn how to do these things, they find them instrumental in how they do their work, helping them to become more effective problem solvers. So there is a wide, I'm going to skip ahead here to say that people find that these skills are really important and that they want to learn them. But very few people have actually been trained in these skills. All of this is online, and I'm happy to point people to the URL afterwards. I think I have a URL here that basically goes into all this data, both from the United States and in Australia. But essentially, there's a wide gap between the awareness and the doing of these things. In many cases, there isn't even awareness, but there surely is a gap in terms of the doing of these things. When it comes, though, to how people want to learn them, what stood out in asking people about a wide range of factors, do you want to learn online, do you want to learn offline, do you want to learn on the weekend, do you want to, nope, nobody cared about any of that. They all cared about, we sort of got 1% answers to every single thing we asked people, except the question of whether people want to learn how to apply these skills to their own jobs, whether they want to be coached instead of just trained, whether they want to actually develop the ability to apply these skills in their own work. So let me use one more minute to conclude by saying it is incredibly important, and being here in a School of Public Policy and Public Administration, I wanted to talk about what this idea of retraining the next generation of leader and public servant. But we have to recognize that it's not enough to train lone individuals. We have had a history over the last 10 years now of trying to bring innovators into government, the data scientist, the UX designer, the engineer. But those people are incredibly frustrated because they exist in legacy institutions that still abide by old ways of doing things. And it's incredibly important not only to build skill sets among individuals, but to change mindsets across whole institutions. To be able to create the Experio lab that they have in Sweden, or MindLab that used to exist in Denmark, or now the countless labs that we are seeing here spring up through GovTech in Singapore, the effort to build innovative institutions that know how to be more agile, and that understand that we need to create institutions that enable innovation. So I'm going to stop. This is more data from the survey, so I'm going to stop on that and leave this up here to conclude, and so we can embark on a conversation around what it means to be a public servant in the 21st century. I think it means practicing a new set of skills. If you're interested in a little bit more about what those skills are, we've created free introductions to each of them at this URL, because we're trying in my work through the state of New Jersey to think about how do we catalyze and train 70,000 public servants in that state with a new mindset and skill set. And to do so in the privacy of one's own home, where one can freely confess you don't know what blockchain is, or you can't define machine learning, and you sure as hell don't know how to define a problem or work with citizens. It is not, as much as we can say citizen engagement and collective intelligence are good things, we have to realize that it is a skill to know how to listen. It is a skill to know how to have a conversation. And it is a skill to know how to work with data to understand a problem, and we have not been training ourselves to know how to do these things. We don't have to automatically know them. We have to learn them, and that's where we need to invest our efforts. 20, please.
That was 20 minutes promised, 23 delivered. So normally people go on for far longer, but they don't have the phone. So.
I pride myself on the internal clock that it's jet lag, I confess.
So just for people who don't know more than the cursory bit of your background, tell us a bit about GovLab. So you've given us a kind of taste of the argument, but what is the lab and why did you set it up, and what does it do? I mean, you've given us some taste of it, but what's the institution?
Right. So so GovLab is a nonprofit think and do tank that exists within New York University, but we are not an academic institution so much. We work exclusively with public sector institutions, and I'll say in a minute with private sector institutions on helping public sector institutions, but we work with public institutions on uses of technology and data and innovation to improve people's lives. So I've been doing work in the space of online on uses of technology in government to strengthen democracy, strengthen and improve the delivery of services for a long time under various different names. As I change universities, we just change the name. But we set up this effort, whether this one or previous incarnations, in an effort to help provide advice and expertise in an applied fashion, that is to say, in a format that people in government can use, i.e. short, and to the point, and focused on the needs of people in public institutions to know how to adapt and adopt new technologies to do a better job at solving problems for citizens. So we exist to do applied research, to do projects. We used to also build a lot of technology, but now as we've developed, as the world has proliferated the number of civic tech platforms and projects, we do less building of software and more applying software to do projects with public institutions, as well as capacity building and training, since what we've discovered is you can't write a report and hope that people will adapt, again, these ways of working, that we actually have to help people know how to apply them in their own work. So we do a lot of coaching, both online and off, to help people adapt and adopt these new ways of working in their own job.
And so give us a sort of, what are you working on at the moment that is exciting, that you're sort of jazzed about, you're at the cutting edge of this stuff. So you mentioned a few things, we didn't mention your own projects, so.
Exciting or frustrating, which is, I think they're the same.
Okay, go on. Well, we'll have frustrating, that's fine.
The harder it is, the more exciting it is. So in no particular order, so a lot of my work has been spent on, although I do a lot of, the GovLab team does a lot of work on how we use data to solve public problems. And where our work has evolved, having spent a lot of years, and I was part of the movement to set up data.gov and to open up to sort of first generation creation of open data policies, what we've discovered is that as the world has come to understand the importance of using data and evidence-based thinking to solve problems, we are underutilizing most of the data that's generated in the world. So in fact, while we still work with governments on uses of open data, we're working a lot with companies on trying to free up corporate data in order to solve public problems. So if you want to talk about helping refugees or solving other problems, the best data you're going to find is not collected by governments, it's collected by mobile phone companies or satellite companies that are tracking movements of people. So we call this our Data Collaboratives Project, and we're working with partners like UNICEF, and other institutions around the world on projects of setting up public-private data partnerships. So for example, in India, working with a range of partners on strategies to combat teen suicide using data from private as much as public sector sources. We're working in Scotland with partners on efforts to reduce childhood obesity, since again, the data about what children are eating, what they're buying, what they're doing, and their habits are coming from digital platform providers as much as they are from government, even in high-functioning countries. And in low-functioning countries, you see lots of places where there's no data collected effectively by government, and the best data you're going to have is coming from the private sector. One more example. So we do a lot of stuff on the data side. We affectionately like to refer to our work as data and people. So I lead a lot of our work in terms of the people and collective intelligence side of things. And right now, as part of a work we've been doing over the last few years called our Crowd Law Project, crowd.law, which are efforts to rethink how legislatures and city parliaments and city councils work with citizens to get better at making new laws. We've been tracking what's going on around the world in places like Taiwan, where they've worked with 200,000 citizens to craft 26 pieces of national legislation. In Reykjavik, where 20% of the population is actively involved in the Better Reykjavik platform, creating solutions to urban problems with government there. We're now, for our pain, and this is the frustrating part, trying to work with the US Congress, congress.crowd.law, on adopting or adapting any of these practices from the rest of the world in how the US Congress works, a place where, as you've seen, trust rates in Congress are at 4%. There is the general view, and this is empirically true, that there's really almost there's negligible to no impact that an individual has on how we make law in the United States, and we're trying to do something to change that.
So, I mean, what was your experience, just again, a little bit more background. So you worked in the Obama White House, which had a lot of smart people brought in to do these innovation data projects. What was your role there, and in a sense, how did you emerge from that? Did you emerge optimistic about what can get done? Or, I mean, often people go into government and kind of run into the wall and kind of emerge with a broken nose, as it were, feeling downbeat about what can be achieved. How was it for you?
As someone said to me today, I've bashed my head so many times against the wall that I've made a hole in it. And I said, yes, then you can see the light shining in from the other side. So there's a way in which I think to do this work, to work with government, you turn on the news today and you hear so many stories about governments around the world abusing their citizens, corrupt governments, violent governments, that it's sometimes easy to lose faith in the role of government to do good. but I guess that was inculcated in me from an early age for a lot of reasons, since I'm a student of history and I know what happens if you don't have flexible, effective, democratic institutions that are actually competent in what they do. There's so much good in that government also can do. So I'm an eternal optimist. I think the question is, you want some Obama gossip? Is that what we want a little?
Give us a flavor. What did you get up to when you were in the heart of things? This was the era of, in a sense, not doing the stuff you're talking about here is more advanced. This was more the first stage of trying to dig out all the public data that the government had locked in cupboards and putting it up on platforms and getting people to use it. That's what we're talking about?
Yeah, so 2 or 3 quick examples. So yeah, I mean, the goal, the sort of mantra we set for ourselves, the vision or the lodestar, was changing how government works by means of 3 values: transparency, participation, and collaboration. And the transparency part was, again, this was the first generation of realizing that we've had 50 years of freedom of information laws, of an adversarial, antagonistic relationship between citizens and government, where citizens demand data and government fights providing that data. It was the first generation of realizing, thanks to early data science and analytical approaches and new tools and technologies, that if we make data available to people, they will use it for the productive purpose of solving problems, of changing from the equation, from the mindset from one of an adversarial relationship to one of a productive, collaborative relationship, by trying to put data up online and make it easier for people to find it. And as we were discussing today, it was a very deliberate choice at the time, rightly or wrongly, to say that much of the data people wanted from us was nuclear secrets. It was, the stuff buried, the skeletons in the closet. And we made a deliberate decision to say, we can spend the next 4 years fighting to get data out of the military-industrial complex, or we can put up environmental data tomorrow. We can put up public health data tomorrow. We can take data that is already public and lying in drawers, and we can make it machine readable so that people can use it to solve problems in new ways. So a lot of the early efforts were really spent on, the focus was on data and freeing up data. But it was also, one of the first projects we did, it was a mixed bag in terms of success, was to create an open government project and to say, let's develop our policy openly by putting up a blog with comments on the White House website. Don't try this at home. You know what happens? People comment if you give them a megaphone. And so, we learned a lot about how to do things and how not to do things, but we both created and modeled how participation could be done, and the great part was that people copied what we did. So let me end the anecdote by saying that one of the kind of best things that I got to do in my job, we were a very, very small office, and you may not know if you haven't visited the White House, is on the West Wing. It looks really big, because on the West Wing they're always they're walking and talking, and they seem to be walking down endless hallways in the West Wing. The hallways are really short and there isn't that far to go. So that's not real. It's a really small office for the most part. Most of the executive office of the president sits in another building, which is a bit bigger with bigger hallways, but we're pretty small and pretty under-resourced. So if you want to get something done, you have to work with agencies. Agencies are the ones that have budgets, and they're the ones that own problems to solve. And so the best thing that I was able to do, particularly because my team was too small and we had too little money to do anything ourselves, was to go out and talk to agencies and say, what problem are you trying to solve? Let's talk about how you might use data or how you might engage with citizens to solve that problem differently than you're doing now, and to do so faster and better. And so it was really the ability to leave behind and catalyze lots of innovators in the civil service who are still there and still working, despite what you read in the paper. You read nothing about what they're doing, since there's a more entertaining circus to read about now at the top. But what's going on underneath the top is still a lot of good work.
Let me ask about that. So, in the Obama era, there was a sort of sense of, I think, a sense of kind of optimism, investment in government, a belief in improvement in government. For all sorts of reasons in the Trump era, and maybe more generally, I suspect people are rather pessimistic about the state of American public administration. So, in a sense, have things are the sort of things that you're talking about still going on in the US federal government, or do you have to look to other parts of the state governments? And in general, are you worried that there's a decline in the quality of American public institutions relative to what it was, let's say, 10 years ago?
Let's divide that into two parts. I think there is, to your first question about sort of what's going on, there's still good work going on. There is now a human-centered design team in the Office of Personnel Management that is training and teaching human-centered design and changing the practices of how people deliver services. There is still a data team in the General Services Administration and a data architecture team thinking about how to free up more data and how to use data to solve problems. There's still lots of stuff going on. However, what you see beneath the surface of this circus is a concerted effort that has been ongoing for the last 40 years since Reagan to eviscerate the analytical capacity of the public service as much as possible. So, for example, you will not have heard about the fact that in our agriculture department, they made the move. The agriculture department had a very well-regarded research service that did the research on things like the dangers of sugar, too much sugar in the diet, and such things as this. And what they did was they announced that they were going to move the research department from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. And what do you think happens when you announce that the research department is going to get moved to a place like Kansas City? Everybody leaves. End of research department. We no longer then have impartial experts in government writing about sugar. The only people we can get information and advice from then are beverage companies and snack companies telling us what the policy should be around sugar. So there are lots of moves like that. You've read about the kind of fights at the State Department that are designed to get people to quit, and they're quitting in droves. We have a public service that has 95% of the public service is over the age of 30. We have no young people that work in the federal government. So they're just trying to kill them off by attrition. Now this is a longer discussion about the fact that the federal government in the United States, as elsewhere, has expanded, its remit has expanded, it's gotten bigger. But there is a concerted effort to essentially eliminate much of this analytical capacity, at least in the U.S. government, as to whether there was a halcyon day gone by. I think in most cases in government, it's been under-resourced, and you don't have this kind of capacity at the state and the local level to begin with. It's not that it was there and we got rid of it. At the federal level, we're doing what we can to get rid of it. So I think that there's really just an issue of there's good stuff that's happening, but it's increasingly difficult right now to get stuff done.
So let me ask a little bit about the sort of challenge that you set, but also move a little bit to here in Asia. So you have spent a week in Singapore. Singapore is often seen, along with the US and Estonia and various others, as a kind of leader in this field of technologically enabled digital government. I mean, what is your sense of what you've learned from here in Singapore? I mean, what have you seen? How do things measure up?
So let me give a caveat. So a few weeks ago, I was in Catalonia in Spain, or maybe I should just say in Catalonia, depending on your views on this. And I was on a TV show, and the person interviewed before me was from Iceland, talking about the Catalan crisis. And I said, I was a little puzzled and the answer was, so she's an activist from Iceland who had been in Catalonia during the trials of the now sentenced Catalan separatist leaders. She had attended one day of the trial for 2 hours. And that made her an expert on the Catalan crisis, enough to speak on television about the Catalan crisis. So, all that to say, a week in Singapore, while more than 2 hours in Catalonia, does not make me an expert. This is my 5th trip, but I want to, instead of telling you what I think, I want to tell you what I heard from people, if I may do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, what I'm selecting is selection bias, but I want to I want to caveat my remarks to say that I'm far from an expert. So there is here, my impression coming away and what I've heard from everybody is a tremendous push around tech and digital. An effort, obviously, to train people in greater digital literacy, to train people in technology. But there is also a debate at the same time about what is the right level of digital literacy for the public service in the 21st century. Do we need to train people how to code? Do we need to train people in how to scrape data? Or do we need to train people only in how to think about data or how to think about or be familiar with technology? So I didn't hear a resolution to that question, and I can put this back to you and to the crowd if you think there is one. But I think there is a robust and healthy debate around, yes, we need this push to know digital, but not a clear view about what the right level is, number one. Number two, there's a real desire, again, to embrace digital and technology, but that's to some extent still disconnected from this question of problem solving. It's a view of, bright, shiny object, AI, machine learning, blockchain, et cetera. We have to know what these things are, but the question of how do we apply them, how do we use them ethically, how do we use them in government to solve problems, still a thing I think that not just Singapore, but a lot of places are grappling with. There's also a big push, which is really exciting to me, a kind of vision for this concept of SG together, of the idea that we will develop services not just for citizens, not to citizens or at citizens, but actually with citizens. But there is yet to there seems to be some effort to think about how to catch up, how to have the kind of work catch up with the slogan, to really think about how do we change the way we work to engage with citizens. So real efforts now in terms of service delivery and design to use human-centered design to talk to citizens. This place is fairly small. It means there's a lot of work in terms of face-to-face focus grouping. There's some new innovative efforts around using citizen juries, deliberative groups of like 50 citizens to talk about issues and come up with solutions, but not as much of I'm not hearing as much about use of technology to actually scale up engaging with citizens, and a real sense that there may be a lack of maturity, not just on the government side, but also on the citizen side, and a distrust on both sides about how to build that capacity for collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that that's almost the most challenging part of the agenda that you're laying out, which is mass citizen deliberation or participation in policymaking. So Singapore government is world leading on behavioral insights, on human-centered design, but I mean that final piece that you were talking about is much more difficult and requires a much wider change in the way that policy is made and is much less sort of technocratic, much less amenable to being run by engineers.
Yeah, so things which are like, we're going to take things we do now but do them better and faster. So we're going to take government information, which is now provided across 10 different websites and 10 different authorities, and put them in one place. So there is this concept of the Moments of Life project, to be able to give a citizen everything that they need to deal with the birth of a child or the death of a person. How do you essentially take what used to be siloed government services and bring them together in one place? I'm doing a similar project with my team in New Jersey that we call the Business First Stop project. So instead of having to go here to the tax authority and there to economic development to get an incentive and over here to get the permits and licenses that I need, can I have those available to me all in one place? And can I use a chat bot that will tell me where I can quickly find out what are the things that I need and find them all in one place. So that's leading edge here in terms of better delivery of services and rethinking of how to do that. But when it comes to rethinking how we do things from the bottom up, not just reorganizing information, but fundamentally changing how we solve problems, working with people outside of government, that's a culture change, which is not just a matter of technology and platforms. It's really about changing processes and changing ways of working. Singapore is no further behind on this than anybody else is. I think we're seeing pockets of innovation in lots of places, but not the kind of systematic or systemic innovation that we're going to see going forward.
So 2 final quick questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience, which are about in a sense, a school like this, so, and how you educate the public entrepreneurs or civil servants of the future. So the typical image of a civil servant is a classic generalist in countries like the US or the UK, and to some degree in Singapore. By analogy, an organization like McKinsey that used to hire generalists is now hiring tons of data scientists and AI specialists and technical specialists. I mean, you asked the question, does everybody need to code? I mean, what are the skills that a public policy school like this should be teaching its future public leaders that it's not teaching now?
So I would say that, coming back to the slide with the bubbles and the lines and the arrows, that teaching people to solve public problems and to do so cognizant of both, number one, with data and using collective intelligence is one of the big gaps. We're right now, so for example, in the top 25 public policy schools in the United States, there's not a single one of them that requires a course in data science. There is none of them that requires a course in the use of collective intelligence or engagement. So this is still a place we're dramatically behind. I was part of a group of actually mostly public policy school deans, which I was lucky to be invited to at Stanford, that put out a statement. I saw Frank Fukuyama's face on the wall here. He's having spoken here. He's led the effort to put out a statement around the need to teach public problem solving to students. So partly it means a new set of, a mission around solving public problems. It means a new set of skills like uses of data and collective intelligence. It means engaging with real people in the real world, not just preset cases in public policy textbooks. And I know schools have capstones and have internships and have externships, but they're very often, we're doing too many like pre-baked cases and not enough where we actually have to define the problem with real people as opposed to being handed the problem, which is what happens in a policy analysis course today. So there's, and the kind of teaching people that the mindset is not to be the expert at arm's length from people, the dispassionate public servant working behind closed doors, which is how which was the right way to do things in the 20th century as a reaction to the corruption and venality and self-serving practices that were common and rampant in government in the 19th century. But now in the 21st century, in a world in which people want to design their own solutions to their own problems and expect to do things for themselves, the ability to use data, to use technology, and above all to use those to have conversations with people means a different way of thinking about how we solve problems that I don't think we're doing, not just in public policy schools, but we're not doing it in law schools, we're not doing it in engineering schools, and we're above all not doing it across those disciplines. Last point on this, one of the things I heard echoed this week over and over and over again was, we've brought in engineers, we've brought in designers, we've got these great people who've come from Google and Amazon and here and there, and there is still this oil and water inability to have people across these disciplines work together on solving problems for people. And that's one of the things we're missing in terms of how we train people, is that we're not teaching people in teams across disciplines, I think, enough to focus on solving problems for real people. But you can disagree with me.
Sounds to me like you should be the dean of a public policy school. Okay, let's throw this open. So I see we'll take a few questions maybe at a time. Go ahead at the back. You're going to have to shout, I think, because you don't have a microphone in front of you, but shout and I'll repeat the question. Oh, whoever's excited right now, you can turn your phone off, please. Go ahead, and maybe introduce yourself if you don't mind.
John from Institute of Policy Studies. So thank you very much for sharing your insights on using open data to improve public services. I think you spoke a fair bit about the open part of it, working with people and being collaborative. So I was wondering if you talk a bit more about the data part of it, specifically what constitutes data. So in an era where big data, in an era where big data are privileged as cutting edge, numbers and statistics are privileged as rigorous, whereas qualitative data is dismissed as anecdotal. What do you think about your views on incorporating the qualitative or ethnographic kind of analysis into public policy making? And
Okay.
Let's take one more. Did I see? Okay, there we are.
Hi, I'm Clara Fung from Cost Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. So we work very closely with global open government partnership globally. So I just wanted to raise 2 quick points. So I think one question is, I meet a lot of young civil servants across the region, and they've been educated from this school as well as many other global public schools, and they come in with lots of new innovative ideas. But the question is, when they go back to their home country and they have to serve in their civil service, this is where there are a lot of cultural challenges that they face. So I think that's one point. And the other point, perhaps from your perspective, having been involved with Open Government Initiative, what's your take on the open government movement, and particularly the relevance of open government partnership as well as we move forward?
Should I take those quickly? Okay. So to the first point, yes. One of the things so to the point about use of qualitative and quantitative, what I'm seeing a lot of, so some of the work that I've been doing recently is looking at how different public sector institutions are training people, interested in how these innovation skills are being acquired. And what you're seeing is a lot of ideological adherence to one approach or the other. So in Argentina, 17,000 people have been taught human-centered design, but they can't use data science. And then in Chile, by contrast, the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez is teaching, very excited, they're working together with the Data for Social Good program from Chicago to teach people how to use data to address challenges, but they're not doing anything on how to work with citizens. And I could give you more examples like this. I think the most successful teams are the ones that are using both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So they brought down the murder rate in New Orleans by 25% because they both looked at the data to understand where the problem was happening and get a global view of it. But then they talked with victims of gun violence, perpetrators of gun violence, families, social care organizations, and it was doing both that led to the understanding of the problem. And I could repeat examples like that for you. So the question implies the solution, which is absolutely right, is that you have to know how to do both. And this partly answers your question about what we need to do differently in schools. I think to the second question, let me start with the last piece about the open government movement. So there's lots to be happy about with regard to having created a global movement that's focused on changing the practices of government, being more transparent, engaging with citizens more. 2 challenges, not clear that they're avoidable or were avoidable, but they're challenges that we can diagnose now. 3 challenges. One is what started as an effort to get countries together and therefore led to these are big foreign policy meetings. You know, it started at the UN with presidents and leaders and prime ministers shaking hands and flags waving in the background and diplomats talking about diplomatic thingies around an agenda which is essentially a domestic agenda. So you have a foreign policy people going, oh, open government, but then it's taken 10 years to kind of create the bridge between the foreign policy aspects of it and essentially what is a domestic agenda in my view. Second thing is open government partnership was stood up as a 2-legged stool. Government and civil society were at the table. Academia was absent. And so the part which is how do we develop an evidence base and how do we develop an evidence base quickly and how do we leverage research, we're kind of playing catch up in the discussion between government, civil society, and the academy, which is one of the primary purveyors of data and kind of possessors of data science talent. So there's a catch-up game to be played in terms of adding a 3rd leg. A 2-legged stool is not very stable, and it sort of needs that 3rd leg, I would say. And the third part is a challenge that's very common to government, and it was very intentional at the time, which was let's let governments declare what projects we will do, and then they can declare victory. Mission accomplished, we did the project. But no capacity to assess so what. And frankly, I think it's really important to be honest about the fact that we can talk about citizen engagement or collective intelligence, but unless it leads to better solutions to problems, it's a so what. And we have a little too much effort invested in kind of making plans and then ticking boxes, at least at the beginning, where now I think we're playing catch up to say, so what, how are these things that OGP has been promoting actually making a difference? We want to, I think, get to more questions, so I'll just say with the cultural challenges issue, it's why it's so important to provide support to people back at their desk in terms of, I'll go back to that slide about coaching. That's so much about people just wanting the help when they get back into their institution. An institution, they may be an innovator, but they're sitting in a regular old bureaucracy and they're screwed, and they can't move forward. And that's where support and mutual support is just incredibly important.
So a couple of questions over here. So you had your hand up, and then I'll take. Well, let's take three, and we can. Oh my goodness, there's lots here. So okay, we'll take these two here. Let's take these two here.
I've been like lopsided.
Okay, we'll go this side first. The two of you. Introduce yourself.
I'm John from Duquesne US Medical School. I want to ask, as you empower people to solve problems themselves, do you see a declining role of the government over time?
It's an interesting question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Leslie Go. I am the former CTO of the World Bank Group, and currently I do a lot of work in the emerging countries, in Asia particularly. And you mentioned about, in the description of the session, open source. I'm a big champion of open source in many ways, working with multilaterals and academic frontier and government. So I'm curious about your experience on creating the narrative, the right narrative for government. I know Singapore government is very embracive. I'm very much for open source. I'm on the board of directors of Singapore government. So curious about your thoughts on this.
Very good. Can you turn your mic off, please? There we go. You just turned yours on. Okay, now we're good. Go ahead. Do you want to take those two at a time?
John's question is this requires this is a deeply philosophical bottle of red wine kind of discussion about the change. I mean, I've been talking about the changing role of the public servant. And you've asked the right question, in that many people fear. There is a reaction to these ideas of using collective intelligence. One part of this is the reaction to say, wait, but I am either elected or appointed. The taxpayer pays for me to do the job of solving these problems for them. And there is a real way in which this kind of creates that sense of threat. And even if it's not even if we attribute the most benevolent motives, which I do, to saying like, look, this is my job, I'm supposed to get this done. It's an abdication of my responsibility to push it out, to farm it out to other people. So I think there is a longer conversation here about, I don't see this as being about the declining role of government. This is about reimagining, reinvigorating the role of government. The role of government in many places is declining, and that's part of the problem. Government is less effective than it needs to be, and it's less well-resourced than it needs to be. We come back to the fact that if we believe in government, then I think this is the way to actually strengthen the capacity of government, not to eviscerate it. But does it mean changing how we think about the role of what we do in government, to be in the role of stewarding a conversation, and often catalyzing other people to innovate? Absolutely. And
Is there evidence that, so the slide you started with about declining levels of trust, do you have kind of faith that if you can do all the things you want to do, that trust will go back up? Or is trust declining a kind of much more secular, long-term phenomenon?
So I think, there are ways in which people have, and you can say, look, people have always complained about government. That's not a new phenomenon. There is empirical data, and at least in some places, and depends, there's been more studies done in other places than others, that this is not simply a perceptual issue, that there really is an effectiveness and capacity deficit that exists in terms of the ability to solve problems. I do think, but I put it as a hypothesis, that if we change how we work, we will develop better solutions to problems, and through that that greater effectiveness, that will lead to a reinvigoration of trust. But it is a hypothesis. However, I think we do have to do something, and we're running out of options. I don't think that it's a choice. I don't think that the answer is between policy A and policy B, that it ultimately comes down to how we make policy in the first place. To Leslie's excellent question about open source, and I just want to ask you, do you mean open source literally or metaphorically, in the sense of open source technologies or open source as a way of working?
open source technology and also a way of working too, because there's a lot, because to a good part, it's a mindset shift as well. And I used to serve on the various, I still am working on ACT on various areas on AI, blockchain, and the use of open source in our federal government in the United States.
Yes.
So it is both, but the specific areas around embracing open source technology, the use of a lot of the open source library in government.
It's amazing how far we've come. I remember, one of my first public appearances when I was working for the White House. I came back from speaking at a NASCIO conference, and I was called into White House counsel's office and told, you may never mention, I was literally told, do not ever say the word open source in public. That was one of many things I was scolded about frequently. So we've come a long way in terms of now having a policy of open source first, and the recognition that open source technologies are not only they're not necessarily cheaper. They're in many cases cheaper, but they're more secure, and they allow us to, create the tools that work for citizens instead of what works for vendors. That it's, just the better way to do things. So I think we've come a long way in terms of embracing open source. In terms of much of what I'm talking about, essentially grows out of the open source movement and understanding of how collaboration helps us see that all bugs are shallow, as they like to say in the open source world. But that it's really, especially, let me say, in this just one quick example here. So my team was tasked by the governor to say, the governor is very progressive and very focused on issues of equity and equality.
This is in New Jersey, right?
And so when I was called in for my first meeting of what projects will I do, he said, I'm viewed as so much focused on the bottom of the pyramid that you have to, I've inherited the business project. I'm like, why do I get the business project? I have to go help the companies get richer, because I have to do something that's perceived as being good for government. So will you build business first stop, this idea of making all business services available from one place? And so we struggled for a little while, and then, under resource and all of that, what did we do? We said, LA has a very nice version of this. So we called up LA and we said, can we have your code? And they said, okay. And 2 weeks later, we had business first stop, and the governor got to announce it in a speech last month, and we're like super duper heroes. And it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been open source. And frankly, I do see a lot, especially among innovative, excited techies who want to now go into government, a lot of like, I'm going to build the new cool app. The whole idea of being a public entrepreneur instead of an entrepreneur is that you do not have to build unless the world is ending, you shouldn't build a new app, in my view, because it's probably already been built by somebody else, and you should steal it and make it better.
Very good. I'm looking at the clock ticking down here, so I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then Beth's going to go. So, okay, we'll take three. The two of you, and over here on the right. So, and make them short, please. Turn your microphone back on.
It's on, yeah. I'm a public policy researcher, and I have a question about the open data. There was a lot of expectation, but in a way it has not really changed accessibility of government. And so by ticking off the boxes and government putting out data sets online, it has not really changed the way of working, how citizens and governments work together across Asia. So I wonder how you also need a physical space. So you mentioned the Mind Lab in Denmark. And I think these kind of futurizing centers or future centers or labs, that's probably something that we need much more in the region.
Great. Public data, right. Did it disappoint? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a researcher with the Faculty of Law at NUS. So I just have a quick question on your comment that there needs to be more collaboration between the government, civil society, and academia. Because in the course of my work, when I interact with the government, I've heard comments such as, we spend quite a bit of our time fending off academics. Well, I don't know how representative this sort of thinking is, but I suspect that it might be there. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on encouraging a more collaborative mindset as opposed to one that's more combative? Right.
Very good. And one final question. Go ahead.
Hey, my question is more about government-to-government cooperation in AL and open data management. Because recently there's a very big protest going on in my country, in Central Asia. Like there's other governments, they propose to set up this facial recognition, sovereign camera all over the capital city. Certainly, like our Kyrgyz government, we lack of ICT infrastructure. We don't have this enough data scientists, and we have absolutely no idea how to defend our own national security and the human rights things. However, our government said, listen, this is a global movement. We need to join. We need the help of the other governments who with the advanced technology. But my people, their concern it is how we have this readiness enough to collaborate with the other governments, and how we can make sure our human rights and our national security will not be misused or misguided by the external party.
Right.
Okay.
There we go. That's quite a
2 minutes.
2 minutes for yeah. There we go. Don't even mention China. So
I apologize ahead of time for what will be wholly inadequate answers to incredibly good conversations. I think to the open data point, so I do think there's been a lot of success in the open data movement, and we have more data available today than we've ever had before, and we can point to countless examples of innovative projects that have resulted. There's a wonderful new free open book that was put out to celebrate kind of 10 years of open data movement. It's somewhere like opendata.something. Someone will have the URL somewhere, but it's a 400-page book. But what we've seen with that is it's not enough to put up the data sets. You have to build an ecosystem of people to use the data. You have to start with the problem you're trying to solve. This comes back to the skills thing. You have to start with the problem and then identify what data you need to solve the problem. And that's a discipline for how to do that. There's a skill around how to do that. You can, yes, you can put up the data and there'll be the kid in his basement, in his parents' basement, in his pajamas, who will use the data set to build something cool, but that's not where the real action is. The real action is starting with the problem, working with UNICEF as we've been doing, which understands and owns and what the problems are for children in real places, and then saying who has the data and what do we need to solve that problem. But you have to start with the problem and build the ecosystem around it. In terms of collaboration with academia, it's a two-way street. I was just on, and I don't know if it's going to be responsive enough, but I had a conversation this week. I was at Princeton University, arguably, I think it's now rated the #1 university in the United States, or they like to tell you that every time you talk to them. So they've started a Smart Cities initiative where they want to get together all these academics to think about how to solve problems for cities. And what I'm dismayed about is, again, after this call, they have a whole group of academics with solutions, and not a single city involved in this discussion about smart cities. So you have both sides. So there's, on the other hand, there's a need for those conversations around, yes, what can academics do and what problems can they solve, but then the reality check from cities about what are the problems that real people are encountering, and there has to be a willingness for the two sides to meet. There's a great initiative called, okay, never mind. Never start
That's
an
a very
anecdote
unusual name.
You don't know the answer to. There's so many acronyms in Singapore that I'm now in acronym soup, and I've forgotten this one. But it essentially is it's a nationwide project in the United States to connect cities to universities and to help create that middle ground to shape things. Civic Bridge in Singapore is an effort to help shape collaboration between tech companies and the city, because there needs to be an interface, a kind of middleware between the two. You can't just have problems owned by cities and then smart tech people or smart academics. There needs to be an effort to scope the project in between. To the last point, which I will not do justice to, on, oh boy, we have 30 seconds to stave off revolution and basically recreating the social credit scoring system. This comes back a bit to the open source discussion about what technologies we put in for what purpose, and a much longer conversation, the one you probably wanted to have, about tech ethics and how we think about ethical uses of technology. That, there is the big challenge that we're seeing in so many places, this sense of we have to, do digital and we have to do tech, so we have to race to catch up. And we race to catch up by buying what the vendors sell, installing the cameras, installing the sensors, and failing to ask the question about who owns the data, who has access to the data. And it's really important that we're having these conversations about exactly these questions. It's hard to do it if people don't understand the technology in the first place and they don't know the implications of this question, which is that these sensors and cameras will get installed everywhere and the facial recognition will exist. And yes, it may do some great things, but also the question of how do we be sure that that data is actually being returned back to the citizens who provided it in the first place, requires that we urgently educate decision makers before it's too late. So I wish I had more than 30 seconds to respond to that, but for anything we didn't answer, I think all of this says ways to reach me and ways to find the GovLab, and I'm online. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Gmail through the GovLab, whatever, and feel free to send your comments, questions, hate mail, and we will respond.
Okay, so that was a spectacular tour de force, made even more impressive by the combination of jet lag and grueling multiple days of meetings in Singapore. So can you all please give Beth a huge round of applause? That was a terrific presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming.